really excited to be here today. And in some just early conversations we've had, I can assure you, you're in for some really good advice, good stories, and perfectly timed good content. So what I wanted to just do, as Alan said, I'm with RNC PMK. We are an agency that is really dedicated to culture in terms of all things marketing, communications, really bringing brands into the forefront of culture in all ways and shapes and sizes. So there's no better brand to talk about culture than when it comes to AB InBev, and we've got some real experts in the space. So without further ado, wanted to just give each of them a chance to do a brief self-introduction because we're really going to be covering a lot of ground here with the different brands that they've got going on. So Richard, you want to just jump in first?
Yeah, no problem. So my name is Richard Oppy. I work across the global brands at AB InBev. So that includes Budweiser, Corona, Stella Artois, and Michelob Ultra. And I've been a lifer in the industry. I've been with the company just over 20 years now.
Excellent. Tim, you want to jump in next?
Yeah, not quite as long as Oppy, but with the same accent that's difficult to understand from Australia. But I've been with the business for 13 years. My background actually wasn't client side originally. It was agency side, having worked at the Young Rubicon Group and then What If, which is an innovation company some of you might know of, but look after Stella Artois globally now.
All right. Felipe?
Sure. Guys, thanks for having me here today. Felipe Ambra. I lead the Corona brand internationally. I'm responsible for the brand everywhere else but the United States. And I've been in the business for 20 years, working with Oppy, Tim, and Tracy. It's amazing business.
Excellent. And with that, Tracy, you want to go?
Yes, I cannot compete with the number of years of the crew here, but I've been with AB InBev for 10 years, actually more recently on the media side, so it's great to be here on a media discussion. But today I lead Draftline, which is our in-house agency across content and media globally. So it's great to be here.
Excellent. Well, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so we'll dive right in. Richard, let's start with you. So obviously brands have been trying to nail the content game for a long time. This is not a new thing. And as we talk about sort of brands as media, I don't think it gets any better than what AB InBev is doing. And we'll hear some of those examples today. But when it all sort of first began, how did you really sell this in? And if you can also just share a little bit about what you think makes the work that you all are doing stand out, why it's been a success.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if you think about it, we've been talking about content is king for years now. But I would argue that it's important more now than it ever has been before. I think our job as marketers is getting harder and harder. We all know that people are bombarded with anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 messages a day. So we're already fighting for people's attention. And then on top of that, we have to deal with ad blocking. I mean, people are paying for a premium of Spotify and YouTube just to avoid advertising. So I think this has been a big mind shift for us at AB InBev and across our global brands. How we evolve from not just disrupting with traditional equity communications, which is still important. There's still a role for it, particularly as you're building awareness at the top of the funnel. But once people are aware of the brand, we're really focusing on building deeper relationships and building greater meaning of our brands. And we're focused on entertaining with content that people actually want to watch, as opposed to be disrupted and forced upon. And I think the team will share a few examples today on how we've been playing in this space with our global brands, how we've been tapping into people's passion points that are relevant to our brands, and then how we use digital platforms to test and learn, because it's a volume game to really see what's working, what's not working. And one thing is, really focused on when we see content that's working, we then fuel it with media, with paid media. And I think this is often a mistake brands make where they rely purely on the content itself. Even if you think about great movies like Star Wars, they still promote their movies. And I think that's probably the best example. And very quickly, I think one piece of content that I love that we did recently with Budweiser was when Messi broke the record and he scored 644 goals for the one club. We created custom-made bottles that had every goal that he scored, every one of the 644 goals, and we accompanied with a handwritten note from Messi. We delivered it to the goalkeeper he scored the goal against. And one goalkeeper had over 20 bottles sent to him, but it sparked a big conversation. And all the goalkeepers were toasting to Messi. Everyone else jumped in on the conversation. Our brand was at the heart of it. But once again, it was content people wanted to watch. It wasn't something we forced upon people.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point too, and it's sort of twofold. One is that if you can come up with content or some sort of build that is going to really legitimately like engage people and excite them, that they want to talk about it, they want to get their hands on it. I mean, the earned potential of that, right? Like from a PR and buzz standpoint, speaks volumes, and that's so critical. But then on the flip side, there's also a lot of people who I think make content, branded content, and they think, okay, well, now we should only push it out with earned. But actually, your point, would you ever put a film out? Would you ever put a movie out and not actually pay to advertise it? You wouldn't just hope that there's enough good press, right? So it really is the nice balance of an integrated approach, I think, to make sure that once you put the investment into this media, that it's getting the most mileage out of it.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Felipe, I wanted to talk to you for a minute about, why you think that content makes sense specifically for the Corona brand, and just, any specific examples you've done recently that you think bring that to light.
Sure. I believe that Corona, I have the luxury of like managing one of the most consistent brands in the beer industry, I would say, like synonymous to the beach, in a brand that embraces a certain lifestyle, right? And we could argue that Corona is the closest that you can get from a lifestyle brand. And this lifestyle is the lifestyle that our consumers have. So branded content for us, as Oppy mentioned, when you go beyond the advertisement, whenever people are aware of a brand, you want to go deeper. You want to build a higher level of affinity, right? So how can we do that? The branded content plays perfectly on that. It's the intersection between what the brand believes and what the consumers have as passions, their passion points. So we look at this sweet spot, and then we create content at scale, partnering with hundreds of content creators from all over the globe who are the specialists in those passion points from the consumers. So then we're embracing the lifestyle, and then we are sharing content that the brand is present, but it's actually something that the consumers love. So then they are watching, and then we are strengthening the bonding between the brand and the consumers, increasing the affinity, as Oppy mentioned. That's why we are doing it.
That's great. And I'm sure you're, striking the right balance between when you work with these partners, making sure that they are sort of representing and using the brand in the way that you want them to, but also giving them enough creative license so that it continues to appeal to their fan base. That's the whole reason you want to work with these other folks, right? Is not to control and contrive too much, but to let them do what makes them influential in the first place.
Absolutely. Yeah, the model that we created, and we created this structure called Corona Studios, that we launched with our first original content series called Free Range Humans, Life Outside the Cage. But actually, the original IP is kind of the cherry on the top, right? But as Oppy mentioned, it's a volume game in which you test and learn a lot. You fail a lot, small, but then you succeed big, So it's this test and learn game in which you try, learn, you see what works best. And the only way for you to have this game of volume is if you have partnership with people who are continuously creating that. But we don't brief them and say, I need a project on X. It's those are the passion points from our consumers. Pitch to us the project that you love, that you embrace, because we know that they are the best ones doing that. They are the ones who engage with their audiences better than anyone. So if we share the same passion points, naturally, the content is going to be fitting to what the brand stands for. And then the way to incorporate the brand is organic. Right. So organic, authentic, and real is key for Corona in the branded content strategy. So if I can give one advice for people in the branded content industry is find the branded content strategy that fits your positioning, right? Because if you try to do that just because it's sexy, it's the right thing to do because it's the buzzworthy aspect that the industry is pushing, it's not going to work, right? Because you're not going to be true to yourself as a brand. You're not going to be building your brand. You're just going to be doing noise,
Absolutely. Such a good point. So Tim, I know, and Richard had sort of teed you up for this, that you had some great examples of what you're doing. I know with the Stella brand in particular, you've done a lot in the food space. So if you can just tell us all a little bit about sort of what's the journey there for the brand? Why did you land in that area? And, what are some of the key channels you found to work best as you focus in this space?
Yeah, and I think firstly, food is the biggest kind of occasion within the beer category, and that might sort of surprise some people, but it's a massive occasion, and we've been talking about trying to unlock it for years, and really, I think COVID has given us a catalyst to do that as people's consumption behaviour has kind of changed, right? So I think firstly it was occasion, but we also knew that food was much more than occasion. It was also a passion. People are passionate about food, passionate about going out to restaurants. And then, as Felipe said, the sweet spot for us on the brand was that food is kind of an intrinsic part of the kind of aspirational European lifestyle where people take the time to, it's the way they take the time to connect with each other and save a life, right? So that was kind of, we knew the sweet spot between a consumer passion point and what our brand was about. I think the hard thing then, Alisa, was when it comes to creating, it's one thing to find that and then say we want to create content to be able to connect with consumers, but then being able to do it within the sea of content is tough, right? So, we work with a company with Winnan to map the landscape of what type of content consumers were consuming in the food space in the digital world. And we found that 80% of people were searching for recipes and hacks of how to make meals at home. And, the truth of the matter is when we looked at that, we were like, it doesn't have a great deal of relevance to our brand, and it's going to be really tough to cut through. And so kind of what we started to look at is what's our editorial lens? What's our perspective on content? A bit like you were to launch a magazine, what would be your elevator pitch around what it's about? And what we dug into is a couple of things. Firstly, we saw that people are also interested in the stories behind the recipes, the stories behind the restaurants, right? It's more than functional. And so that storytelling was something that we focused on in our content, and something that, like Chef's Table on Netflix gave us a lot of inspiration from. And then I think the second thing is we started to look for convergence of passion points. So not just looking at food, but looking at where food, film, art intersect, and what does that look like? And that's where we started to get some interesting content spaces. And a great example of it is one of the series we're running at the moment is called Director's Cut. And pretty much what we do is we pair an up-and-coming chef, like the most recent kind of episode was using Devon Francis from Yardi. And we paired this chef with an up-and-coming filmmaker, and she was absolutely amazing. And literally, we got these two creators on set, and we got them in a very natural and organic way. What they did is the film that we were kind of profiling was a film called Happy Birthday, Marsha. And it was actually about a very brave drag queen. And the whole content was around the whole film was about the battles that the transgender people have had. And we got Devon, the chef, to create a birthday cake. And they cooked this birthday cake together while reviewing the movie. And the chemistry was authentic and it was compelling. And really, when we compared that, which what we felt was very close to what's at the heart of the brand, versus coming up with just another recipe for how you make zucchini noodles and bolognese, it was clear to us where kind of our heart sort of sat.
Yeah, I love how it's sort of every turn you're talking about the parameters you had in check to make sure that you weren't just saying, okay, well, this is resonating with consumers, so we'll do it. But no, what specifically is actually going to align with our brand? And so I think that authenticity throughout also helps you, to be a success in the end, right? Like it makes sense and helps it to work. So that's great. So kind of evolving the conversation a little bit, Tracy, so curious to hear more about sort of what you do with Draftline, and tell us a little bit about what went into the decision to create this in-house agency, the role the agency plays in developing a lot of what we've been hearing about today, and then how you still work with outside agencies if you do.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, there's a few reasons that we started Draftline. I think a lot of times when people hear in-housing, they go, oh, it's about cost, like they're looking to save cost, which is definitely not the case for us. The first meeting I think I ever had with the CEO on the topic, he was like, if we're doing this to save money, let's not do it. We're a beer company. Like this isn't, necessarily our core competency. We need to do things that are really going to drive our brands forward and are going to drive our business forward. And, when we started Draftline, one of the things that was really clear to us was this gap between content and media that we really couldn't resolve. we are a company with hundreds of brands around the world. I know there are several, large brands who have brought content and media into one agency where they kind of manage that together. But most of those companies only manage one brand. So you take the complexity of like, okay, we have, one media agency generally in each market, and we have tons of content providers, like you just heard Tim and Felipe mentioning, that are servicing our needs. How do we kind of close the gap on that, right? So we really created Draftline to find magic between content and media, because we said, anytime we make a decision about content, there's a lot of the learnings that we're using on that come from media and vice versa, right? So how can we create this ecosystem that's going to be able to support that whole thing? So when we talk about what we're doing, with Corona and with Stella, a lot of those things are only possible because we have an in-house team that's helping connect those dots, right? That is actually working hand in hand with both creators that we have in the company and also creators externally, that is actually doing a lot of our digital media buying, that is looking on a daily, even hourly basis sometimes, how those pieces of content are performing, understanding what things are really resonating with consumers and which of them are, maybe not hitting the mark. And then we make a different decision and we pivot, right? And so having that kind of dynamic learning environment between media and content, I think is so critical for us to be able to bring together this sort of entertaining content that my colleagues have been speaking about.
That's great. Yeah, and I think, this obviously has been a trend, right? We see this with a lot of other companies, but to your point, like getting really clear at the outset about like, what's the reason we're doing this and making sure the purpose is valid and still sort of having those outside checks and balances, I think is sort of the sweet spot. So that's great. Felipe, I'll go back to you for a little bit. I know we started to talk before about the role of influencers, filmmakers specifically, and sort of, what you're doing that I think makes that work so engaging. Can you talk a little bit about the measurement of it too? So when you want to look back and say, okay, this worked, this did, and all the testing you're doing, how are you able to look at, what is successful and measure it from a KPI standpoint? And then how do you even plan the cadence of it all so that you're not doing too much, too little? How do you look at that?
I believe that this is a discipline that is evolving a lot as we speak. I would say that probably in the CPG industry, nobody has kind of the perfect answer for this question. But I would say that in the last 24 months, we learned a lot. With Free Range Humans, our first IP, we used that as a very important learning process. We did lots of brand lift studies in the various countries that we were airing Free Range Humans. So basically trying to understand if pre versus post exposure, we were getting kind of the level of brand recall that we would have with advertisement, the level of purchase intention lift, the level of like brand affinity lift, because that was a big question, like, is branded content as effective as advertisement in branding, whatever you need for the brand? And what we learned is that it is. And there are some other things that we can benefit from the branded content, such as, for example, the level of interaction with the content is much higher. So, for example, the average viewing time for branded content for us on Free Range Humans was 6 times higher than the average viewing time that we used to have with an ad, right? Which is great. And the second question was like, in terms of cost, is this going to cost us more to air, like the paid media? And what we learned is that it's not, because the quality of the content is higher, the level of engagement is higher. So then the platforms, because it's an auction-based kind of buying, they benefit you, right? Just because the quality of the content fits better what the consumers are aiming to get. So we learned a lot in terms of the testing. I would say that keep continuously testing something that we are doing. As Trace mentioned, Draftline is key for us in this process. So we have an integrated team between media and the creative team that is testing a lot. So as I mentioned in the beginning, it's like failing small, right? We fail a lot. And that's good because sometimes you learn more from the failures on what not to do. And then when you succeed, it's like, okay, this is the right direction to go. And then you bet big and you scale up and you succeed better because then you get better CPM, then you get a better engagement, better average viewing time. So just coming back to the piece on the content creators, but then, as I mentioned, if you need to fail a lot, you need to have a lot of inputs, right? Lots of content. Then you need a big network. And it would be impossible for us to build this network with hundreds of content creators if we were doing that in the, let's say, traditional way, because it's a game of volume, as Oppy mentioned. It's a game of kind of agility. And working directly with these content creators, with the team on Draftline, enabled us to get access to hundreds of contents on a weekly basis that then we test, and everything that works, we then scale up with paid media, and potentially that become the next IP for the brand,
Yeah,
Felipe,
yeah.
it's worth touching on, Felipe, the role that the trailers play in promoting the content, almost replacing what traditional advertising does.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a great learning, because if you go for a strategy of only airing a 6-minute film, it's going to be very expensive for you to buy for, let's say, click or engagement, right? But then you translate that 6 minutes into a 15-second trailer, not an ad, a trailer about the content. And then you can integrate the brand in a way that is authentic and that is kind of organic to the kind of trailer that you're creating. And then that you wear for reach. And what we learned is that this trailer is as effective or sometimes more effective than an ad, right? But again, the advertisement still plays its role on building the credentials of the brand. It's product centered sometimes, right? The branded content entertainment is centered on the passion point, on the emotional side of the brand building, on building the affinity. So it's not a game of one or the other, it's an end.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Tim, let's hear your thoughts, because we are obviously talking a lot about how, one of the examples you just gave, Felipe, was how some of the content you had performed 6 times better than a traditional ad. Do you think the 30-second ad is dead? Does it still have its role? And, tell us a little bit about how you find the right editorial angle for content, because it's obviously a very, very crowded landscape, with what brands and non-brands are doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that question of, is the 30-second ad dead is probably one that's been asked a lot, and probably people on this Zoom call are sick of kind of hearing the responses. But I think in truth, the way the question is framed kind of provokes a very binary response. But the real answer, which is less kind of sexy, is that it's not 30-second ads certainly aren't dead, but it's very unlikely, and they're probably even now no longer the primary unit of advertising anymore, right? I think, on the one hand, we know the whole ad model is being disrupted, as Rich said, by ad blocking, but also subscription streaming services, right? And I guess, free to air and cable TV are like the spiritual home of the 30-second ad. And we all know that what we've seen is, with audience fragmentation, is that the free-to-air audiences have not only declined, but also the wealth of the consumers that watch free-to-air has declined. Now, the net result of that is the fact that clients are going to be much more reluctant to go and spend $5 million on creating a 30-second ad for a lower demographic kind of profile that you're now getting on free to air, right? So outside of Super Bowl, it becomes very difficult to justify the production expense on something like a 30-second ad. And then I guess in the digital space, the reality is the biggest social platforms are still ad driven in their model, right? When you think about, Facebook and YouTube, it's still an advertising model. But what we see in those channels is the 30-second unit is no longer native, right? It's not a native unit to Facebook or YouTube. And as kind of Felipe said, what we're seeing in those formats, it's either shorter, 6 or 15, or driving to longer in 3 to 6 minutes, right? So I think there sums up the plight of the 30-second kind of ad. I don't think it will still exist on free to air. I think clients will spend a lot less money on production, but the fundamental primary unit of advertising right now has probably shifted to a 15-second piece of film, not a 30-second piece of film, because of those kind of dynamics that we talked about.
Yep. Well, and with so much being out there and attention spans being like increasingly shorter and shorter, it makes sense that you're either really captivating some people in content that's longer form. I mean, even I think about, like, in a different vein, podcasts are being so popular. That's like a serious commitment to sit and listen to a podcast, but the narrative, the storytelling, and what you can do there, otherwise it's like bite size. So that makes a lot of sense.
Well, I think the only build on that, right, is, and Felipe kind of touched on it. We heard the same thing when we caught up with Lego some time ago, and they talked about the fact that they're today more likely to make an ad out of content than an ad as a standalone ad, right? Which kind of is in line with what Felipe said. I think the biggest challenge that you have, though, is that in reality, you've got to find ways to get your brand recognized and attributed in that process of creating content, right? And I think Felipe does it because he has a very strong kind of distinctive brand, and Red Bull are the masters of it, right? Like they create unbelievably compelling content, but their brand naturally fits into that content. You know, when you think about the recent kind of even, you know, like the F1 Netflix series that's on, it feels like content, but there is the Red Bull brand front and center throughout the whole thing, right? And that's the trick, and that's not an easy thing to do in a way that is authentic and feels natural. And as Felipe said, the balance of, if you start creating ads again, you're going to turn off consumers. If you create content that has no link back to your brand, you're not going to move anything. And there is the challenge that we deal with.
Yeah, you got to find that sweet spot. Absolutely. So Richard, as a beer company, you know, obviously responsibility has taken on a whole new name in this year that we've all been living in with the global pandemic. So, you know, I would just say, how have you navigated that? How has it changed what you're doing, evolved what you're doing? And then also speak, you know, a little bit about the role of sustainability for the AB InBev brands, because obviously that's been an area that you've all been a leader as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think big companies like AB InBev and big brands like our global brands, I think we have an opportunity and really a responsibility to use our force for good. How do we use the fact that we're a big brand with big audiences to make a big impact? And I think a good example was actually when the pandemic hit. We took our responsibility to support the community and to support the people we serve, and that's our consumers. And at the time, you know, I was really proud of what the company did. Like, we pivoted our breweries to start making hand sanitizer. We were filling oxygen tanks. We even helped build hospitals in Mexico and Brazil. I think you'd say we went well beyond what you'd expect from a brewer to support the community. And I think as we move forward, we will continue to use our force for good when it comes to sustainability. And maybe if I give just a couple of examples across our global brands, for Budweiser, we have a commitment where we are going to brew all Budweiser with 100% renewable electricity by 2025. And we're already doing this in a number of countries. And we've actually invested with our vendors around the world over $1 billion in infrastructure to support this initiative. And so we really hope that we can inspire other companies and other brands to follow suit, and really to remind people that a brighter future is in our hands. And then with Stella Artois, we often take for granted, but there are millions of people around the world that they don't have access to clean water. And with our partnership with water.org, we've been able to provide 2.3 million people in developing countries access to clean water. And this is something we're really proud of, the impact we've been able to make. And then on Corona, we're looking to take action to commit to a net zero plastic footprint, where we'll protect our beaches, which is our home. You know, we always talk about protecting paradise. And we hope people to inspire people to follow and to reduce their plastic as well, their plastic intake. So you can see here that as a company and across our global brands, we're not just talking the talk, we're really, you know, walking the walk and taking action.
Yeah, and you're doing it in ways that are authentic to the brands. Like, even as you're talking about Corona, right, which it would make so much sense for that brand to specifically be, you know, leading a charge in protecting our beaches, right? I mean, it's just, you're really linking in ways that I think are going to be meaningful, and I would imagine help build brand affinity. And, you know, when consumers are looking to make choices, right, they want to know at this point, it's like not even, it's just table stakes to do the right thing, I think, especially for younger, you know, Gen Z and millennials, like they just expect it. So these are some great examples.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that's the key, as you said, is not to do it for the sake of it, even though that's what next generation expect. But how do you make sure what you're doing is having a big impact? But how do you build your brand? How does it make sure it's authentic to your brand at the same time? And that's why obviously it's such a natural fit, as you mentioned, as we're cleaning up all the plastic to protect the beaches. The beaches are synonymous with the brand Corona, and that's something we do. We look at it across all our brands, and for Stella Artois, one thing we really talk about is bringing people together to save a life. And unfortunately, a lot of it's the women that spend hours on hours a day walking just to get clean water. They don't have the time to spend quality time with the people that matter because they're always trying to get clean water. So what we want to do is give them their time back, give them the gift of time so they can have quality time with friends and family in what we call the life artois. So once again, it ladders up to what the brand's all about.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I want to see if there's any questions from the audience too, but Tracy, the last question I'll ask you is just kind of to leave the group with any advice. So, what are a few of the best practices you would say to other brands who maybe are not as seasoned as you all are in this space?
I mean, honestly, I think the biggest thing is like humility and learning, right? So as a team, like, you're talking to some very senior people in our company here. I'm talking about them, not me, but, they spend a lot of time in the day-to-day learning, right? And like, we really believe as an organization in this constant journey that we don't know as much as we need to know. We're constantly trying to find out, what is new on how you buy media today? What is new in content best practices? We sit every couple of weeks and like go through individual pieces of content and have discussions on them. And I think that as a company today, you have to put yourself not just in a consumer mindset, but you have to physically act like the consumer. So we're sitting there, on our phones, looking at the same content the same way that they are and having discussions about what's good and what's not good about it. How would we feel as a consumer? Is this something I would skip right past? And so I think it comes down to really learning humility. And then the other thing that I would just say is you have to design your team and your ecosystem to be able to deliver this, right? If you look at our organization, 4 years ago, we were very traditional as a CPG. We had, people that worked on media, we had people that worked on content, we had people that worked on trade, and so on and so forth. And one of our biggest learnings on, running a lot of the content that we're discussing today is you really have to create a dynamic team that is comprised of, someone who really understands brand strategy, someone that really understands media buying, someone that really understands content development. And you've got to put those people together. And that has to be almost their first team rather than like a meeting that they sit in on, right? They really have to be integrated in their way of work and how they do things together. So I would say that's been another really big learning for us is just breaking down those silos. And that's what we've really strived to do within Draftline, right? Is take down those silos, figure out how we can optimize the ecosystem of what we do so that we can build brands that really capture consumer attention at the end of the day.
Totally. I love that. And I'm looking at some of the questions from the audience now, and I think Tracy will stay with you because I think you'll have a good perspective on this one. And I feel this. It feels like every day there's a new app or a new device that we need to pay attention to. It's the next big thing. Like one day there wasn't Clubhouse, now it's all everyone talks about. How do you make sense of that fragmentation, and how do you evaluate the channels to determine, where you should be because your consumers are there?
Yeah, I mean, we're a very data-driven organization, right? So we're constantly looking at like what's rising, what has actual reach, right? Like I know Tim and Felipe mentioned this earlier. Like when you do things that are just organic, it doesn't really work, right? You've got to have some type of push behind it. So for us, reach on a platform is critical, and if the reach isn't there yet, we're not necessarily, we're going to sit back, we're going to learn, we're going to watch, we're going to listen. I think what's great about how the news industry has been evolving in the last couple of years is there's so many great newsletters that you can get every day in your inbox that give you, these random factoids and things to look into. And so I encourage people, go out, subscribe to as many of those as you can, and try to find the time in your day, right? If you really think learning is important and you really want to know, you've got to carve, 30, 40 minutes out of your day just to do that. And I think that's something that, inherently as a company, we've always been very good at. And that's how we try to stay on, the edge of sort of where things are going.
That's great. Richard, I think this is a great question for you. So what are some other brands that you look up to and other leaders in marketing that you admire?
That's a good question. And I think when you look at the work, I mean, one thing that we really look at is creativity, creativity to solve consumers' problems and people's problems. And I think when you look at, companies that we admire in terms of creativity and thinking outside the square and being more of a challenger. I think Burger King over the last few years have been super creative in a number of their examples, like the McWhopper Detour, and there's lots of examples where they've come up with ideas that I think are more non-traditional, because that was obviously all about downloading the app. It wasn't about a 30-second hero film. But another company that, and obviously Fernando Machado, he's been the brains and the inspiration, I think, for Burger King for a number of years. So I certainly admire him. Mm-hmm. And I think there's other brands that I certainly admire, but right up there, I think is Nike. I love the Nike and Apple for me. I love the work Nike do. And the reason I admire them so much, and we do, is we talk about sort of full funnel marketing, and a lot of D2Cs are very good at the performance marketing and driving conversion at the bottom of funnel. And then big CPG brands are quite good at building the big campaigns and building awareness and cutting through at the top of the funnel. I think Nike are probably the best at the full funnel. You think of their Dream Crazy campaign, which is fantastic. And so they're clear what their brand stands for across all their touch points. And then they're also very good at performance marketing as well. And I mean, I was watching Kapoji, who broke the record in the marathon under 2 hours. And I was watching all that content on the lead up. And then as soon as he broke the record, I had in my inbox an offer to go and purchase the shoes that they just brought out that he was running in. And so it was just a great example of the way they used their full funnel.
Okay, so I'm the end music here, guys. Thank you.
Do we see the light?
Thank you very much. This was a great panel because you actually thank you in another way, because you actually made my job of summing up the day a lot easier. I'm going to try and tie a bunch of threads that we heard together based on what you guys were saying. So what's interesting here is so many of the people who are using CTV tend to see it as a sort of almost a direct response funnel, partly because a lot of the people buying it come from digital and it's a direct response thing, and partly because a lot of the ad tech companies that are measure it very much on a direct response level. How many units did you sell? Those are the sort of KPIs. You guys are doing great stuff with branding because you're not selling cases of beer over the internet. And so you have to look at all of these new media choices in a very different way. And the one thing that you had honed in on, which is something that's very near and dear to our heart at TV Rev, is branded content and how difficult it is to pull off. Felipe, you had such you seriously, there's like so many brands would pay you big bucks for you to just explain to them, like, how does this work? How do you build a funnel? How do you test it? And so many brands have a really tough time wrapping their head around the fact that, no, this actually has to be interesting. Like, you can't just slap your logo and like, why aren't I in there? And, or that like Lego and the Lego movie was because it was Lego. That's why it worked. It wasn't like, but you don't have that. And so and we really think that that's going to be a big thing going forward. A lot of this sort of branded content that fits in with the content, especially in this sort of post-cookie world, fits in with the context of the programming that it's around. So it almost feels like a piece of it, like there's not this disruption when the advertiser's message comes on. So that really is sort of the message of the day overall, of how to use data and the difference between, branding, which is definitely something you can do in all these new media units. It's just figuring out your KPIs, branded content, and just being smart about stuff. So that was really long-winded, but thank you all very much for this. And thank you all in the audience for your sticking around with us all day. And reminder to join us again tomorrow. We're going to be starting at 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific, as opposed to the last 2 days. And we're going to be hearing from a great lineup of thought leaders with brands like PepsiCo, Facebook, MasterCard, Bloomberg, and many, many more. So come back tomorrow. Have a great evening, and we'll see you all soon. Take care now. Bye-bye.